Hello and welcome to Scariest Stories Ever. I figured why not tell some of the best true ghost stories told by a witch? If you happen to like one of these stories, you want to hear more, you know what to do with that like button. Hit the notification. Let's get to our story. Ouija board experiences. The year was 1965. Al and Barb were young parents living in a small apartment building on the Lawrence Avenue West in Toronto. Through their comings and goings, they became acquainted with the few of their neighbors. Some of the friendship began to form with one particular family that lived on the second floor of the building, the Davies. After a few weeks of exchanging pleasantries and corridors, it was proposed that the two couples get together for an evening. Janet and Dick Davies asked if they could get a host for the evening at their apartment. Their two children were at the ages that made disruption at bedtime difficult, where Al and Barb's daughter was young enough to be put to bed for the night in her carriage, which could be taken along wherever they choose to go. Not one of the people interviewed for this retelling was able to recall how the evening conversation would itself around the phenomenon of the Ouija board. In fact, none can remember having a particular interest in exploring the paranormal, which makes the evening experience somewhat more of a supernatural puzzle. Evidently, the topic did arise, because by the time midnight approached, the four young people had fashioned a homemade Ouija board using squares of paper on which they wrote letters of the alphabet, numbers from 0 to 9, and the words yes and no. They spread out over Davy's dining room table. Janet volunteered to use the delicate bone china teacup as the planchette for the makeshift Ouija board. They all turned off the lights, add the requisite ambience created by the lighted candle. Seated beside themselves around the table, the impromptu seance began. All the participants were excited at the prospect of dabbling into something new and unknown. In their navette, they were extremely surprised when the teacup began to move around the table, pointing to letters and spelling out answers to questions they posed. Amid giggles of delight at their newly discovered powers, the four stayed hunched over around the table, their fingertips resting lightly on the teacup, for well over an hour. At about that point, for a long-forgotten reason, they decided to take a break. Whether the board went cold, stopped moving in response to queries, or whether one or more people involved simply just wanted to stop for a while, it just cannot be recalled. After a short time away from the table, they all felt pulled back to the game. As soon as they got back to the table, they put the fingers on their teacup planchette. It began to move. Although no one had asked any questions, startled Dick, who became the spokesperson for the little group, asked if the spirit moving the cup could identify itself. It did so immediately. The answer jolted to Dick's composure. Apparently, they had someone disturbed the spirit of Dick's deceased father. Dick had the older man's namesake, but the two had never related well to one another, and as it turned out, Mr. Davies had died before the father and son were able to reconcile their differences. The lack of resolution meant that Dick lived with the gut-wrenching feelings of anger and frustration towards the memory of his father. Now here he was, a man with whom he had such grief, conflict, imposing himself on the happy, independent life the young man had begun to create for himself. Dick jumped up from his chair, shouting that he had enough. He grabbed the candle and blew out its flames to extinguish it. Much to the man's horror, his slight puff of breath not only did not extinguish the flame, but rather provoked it to flare it up angrily. As his wife and two friends watched in frightened amazement, he tried again. The flame enlarged several centimeters to the height that seemed to grow tentacles of the fire. He set the apparently possessed candle back down on the table. Janet, frightened and very much wanting to end the unnerving episode, then picked up the offering candle. As Dick had done only moments before, she blew it and it extinguished the flame. Oddly, the candlelight did not respond at all again to the puff. It came back on. A current of air that certainly had been strong enough to put out such candle. It went out. The flame simply burned, as though the air around it was absolutely still. Thinking that somehow misdirected her breath, Janice tried blowing on the candle a second, and then the third time, and nothing happened. The flame burned on, completely undisrupted by her efforts to extinguish it. Finally, in desperation, Al took the candle from Janet and blew the candle out, readily accomplishing what Dick and Janet had tried to do. Without a word, the two couples turned the lights on and retired to Davy's living room. After a period of complete silence among the four, they began to piece together a possible scenario for the events they had just been involved in. Clearly, Dick's father was an angry spirit. Whether his anger was over many unresolved issues with his son, or perhaps merely at having his peaceful afterlife disturbed, no one knew. The older man had died before Dick had met Janet, and so he had never known the woman, and who was now his mother of his grandchildren. If in fact it was the spirit controlling the candle's glow, then the difference between the firestorm kind of reaction to Dick's attempts to extinguish it, it would oppose to the complete calm for Janet, was interesting. As the anger entity had no emotional investment in Al, its spirit apparently didn't manifest itself in the candle, and so the flame responded as it should have. An hour later, the little group, Dick especially, remained uneasy. They wondered whether the spirit had left the apartment. It didn't feel as it had, but perhaps it was only the memory of the specter that lingered. Either way, the atmosphere was decidedly unpleasant. When Al and Barb invited their host to bring the children and spend the night downstairs to the apartment, Jack and Dick immediately accepted the invitation. As Dick stood up and began making the necessary preparations for the overnight stay away from home, Janet's teacup planchette suddenly began to move from where it had been resting on the center of the dining room table. With no one near it, but 4 pairs of eyes glued to its actions, the cup slid to the table's edge and inevitably crashed down to the hardwood floor, instantly breaking almost exactly into even quarters. Although no one said a word at the time, the incident added to everyone's determination to take the children and leave the apartment. Once in Al and Barb's apartment, the Davies and the children settled in best as they could and were able considering themselves makeshift accommodations. After a relentless night, they returned to their own apartment, where they found the atmosphere had thankfully returned to normal. They quickly swept the homemade Ouija board from the table into the garbage and put the candle back into the sideboard where it had always been. The broken teacup, however, provided a bit more challenge. Even though it would never be functional again, the clean lines along which it broke meant it could easily be glued back together, if only for display. This possibility was a relief because Janet could not bring herself to think of throwing away the cup. It had always been one of her favorites. Interesting, it had been a gift from Dick's mother, the unwelcome spirit's widow. The frightening seance was for a long time never mentioned among any of its unwilling witnesses. Years later, however, Barb and Al did have the opportunity to discuss it between themselves and with at least one other person. They concluded that they had inadvertently somehow summoned the spirit of Dick's father, apparently against his will. But what of the teacup? What unseen force had pushed it from the table, and why did it not shatter? It landed on the hardwood floor. Was there further significance in that it had broken into 4 pieces? They were even. It had since been suggested that Spirit and its namesake's son, who accidentally disturbed them both, had first and last names began with the letter D. The 4th letter of the alphabet that might be the explanation of the number of fragments, or it could have been referred to as being 4 participants in the seance. As the pieces of broken cup were almost exactly even, perhaps the spirit was implicating all 4 people in the disturbing incident. Not surprisingly, none of the 4 ever attempted to partake in such a game again. In addition, the friendship that seemed to be forming before 2 couples entered into an impromptu seance never did develop. It was decided strange experience for all who had been part of it. They were all surprised that they were willing to indulge in such a dangerous pastime, as they done and heard by results. Some years later, in another part of Toronto, writer and freelance editor Don Hunter had a remarkably similar experience. When I was young, just after my grandfather died, my friends and I held a seance at Halloween. We sealed up the windows and put a towel under the door to block any light that might have crept in. We sat in a circle with the candle at the center and held our hands. I called for my grandfather, telling him I had never had a chance to say goodbye. I felt very odd and asked for a sign. The candle flame shot up in the air. It scared us, but I held the circle, said my goodbyes to him, and we all held hands, and the lights returned to normal again. Everyone was pale and scared, and we never did it again, and we never talked about it again. It is interesting that everyone involved in both incidences immediately vowed never to do anything so potentially dangerous again. If you have a scary Ouija board story, or even a video, please send it all over to scarieststoriesever@gmail.com. Until the next story.